Carl Jung, one of the most profound and influential thinkers of the 20th century, a name that resonates in the world of psychology, philosophy, and spirituality. His ideas, often controversial and deeply philosophical, have shaped the way we understand the human mind, consciousness, and the soul. But who was Carl Jung? What made his theories so revolutionary? And how did his journey through life contribute to our modern understanding of the psyche? In today's deep dive, we will explore the life, work, and legacy of this extraordinary man who sought to bridge the gap between the conscious and unconscious, between the personal and the collective. Join us as we embark on a journey through Carl Jung's life, from the early years in Switzerland, his groundbreaking work with Sigmund Freud, to his development of ideas that still shape the fields of psychology, spirituality, and even art. Carl Gustav Jung was born on July 26, 1875, in the small Swiss village of Kessville, nestled on the shores of Lake Constance. From the very beginning, Carl Jung's life was shaped by contrasts and contradictions, the clash between his father's religious skepticism and his mother's mystical inclinations, the solitude of his childhood, and the powerful dreams that seemed to call him toward a deeper understanding of the human psyche. His father, Paul Jung, was a Protestant minister, a man of faith struggling with doubt. He was intellectual but rigid, adhering to traditional Christian teachings, even as his personal belief system wavered. Carl's mother, Emilie Preiswerk Jung, was an entirely different force, prone to mood swings and spiritual experiences, often speaking of spirits and unseen entities. At times, she would withdraw into her room for days, claiming to be in communion with otherworldly presences. This duality, rational theology versus mystical experience, would later become a central theme in Jung's theories. As a child, Jung found himself isolated and introspective. Unlike other children who played freely, he preferred to explore the natural world alone. He would wander the forests near his home, collecting stones and creating small constructions, almost as if he were instinctively building temples, a foreshadowing of his later theories on archetypes and the unconscious mind. One of the most pivotal moments in Jung's early life came at the age of 3 or 4, when he experienced a strange and terrifying dream that would haunt him for decades. He saw a deep, underground chamber, almost like a king's throne room, with a monstrous being sitting upon a golden throne. The creature had a huge, fleshy head with one eye, staring at him, and its entire body was covered in living, pulsating skin. Young Carl woke up in terror, but he was also profoundly curious. He later associated the dream with primal fears and the presence of the unconscious, something vast and unknowable that existed beneath the surface of everyday reality. This was his first personal encounter with what he would later call the collective unconscious, a realm of archetypes and deep-seated symbols that connect all of humanity. Jung was a bright but solitary student. He had few friends, preferring to read and observe rather than participate in social activities. He was fascinated by philosophy, mythology, and religious texts, even from an early age. However, an incident during his school years almost set his intellectual development back permanently. One day, a stronger, older classmate shoved Jung violently to the ground. The impact was so intense that he lost consciousness for a brief moment. In the following days, Jung experienced bouts of dizziness and fatigue, which worsened every time he had to attend school. Eventually, his condition became so severe that he was pulled out of classes altogether. Doctors could find no physical cause, and Jung himself came to believe that his symptoms were psychosomatic, a subconscious reaction to his fear of failure and social rejection. This was a pivotal realization for Jung. The mind had a powerful, hidden influence over the body. One day, while overhearing his father worry about how Carl might never return to school, Jung had a sudden epiphany. If I do not go back, I will become a failure. My father will never respect me, and my future will be lost. That day, he forced himself to stand up, walked back to school, and never suffered from the fainting spells again. This personal experience with psychosomatic illness and self-healing planted the seed for his later work in psychoanalysis and the power of the unconscious mind. As a child, Jung would often retreat to a large, smooth stone in his family's garden. Sitting on this stone, he would experience an odd, almost mystical feeling, as if he and the stone were the same entity. Years later, Jung would describe how he started to think of himself as having two personalities. Personality 1, the everyday Carl Jung, the schoolboy, the son of a minister, the future doctor, and Personality 2, a timeless, ancient being that existed beyond his physical body, connected to something deeper and more mysterious. This early experience of self-division would later evolve into the concept of the self in analytical psychology, a whole, integrated being that reconciles the conscious and unconscious mind. Even as a child, Jung had been fascinated by dreams, symbols, and hidden forces shaping human behavior. His unusual upbringing, vivid inner experiences, and near mystical encounters with the unconscious mind would form the foundation for his later work. Carl's childhood was not just the beginning of his life. It was a foreshadowing of his destiny. His experiences with dual personalities, dreams, and hidden psychological forces would later emerge as some of the most influential concepts in modern psychology. By the time Carl Jung reached adolescence, he had developed an insatiable curiosity about human nature, philosophy, and the workings of the mind. Yet, when it came time to decide on a career, he faced an inner conflict. Should he follow in the footsteps of his father and grandfather, both Protestant ministers, or forge his own path? Jung initially considered studying archaeology, drawn to the idea of uncovering the ancient past and lost civilizations. However, the career prospects for archaeologists in Switzerland at that time were poor. Jung's family was not wealthy enough to support a future of uncertain income. His father, Paul Jung, encouraged him to study theology, but young Carl had already grown skeptical of organized religion. He respected spirituality, but could not bring himself to accept rigid dogma. Ultimately, Jung made a practical decision. He would study medicine at the University of Basel in 1895. However, it was not the practice of medicine itself that intrigued him. It was the question of what lay beneath human behavior and consciousness. It was during these years that Jung first encountered the field that would change his life forever: psychiatry. During his university studies, Jung frequently visited the Basel University Library, where he would stumble upon a book that would ignite his lifelong obsession with the mysteries of the mind, The Psychology of Dementia Praecox, by Eugen Bleuler. Bleuler was a Swiss psychiatrist working at a psychiatric hospital in Zurich. His research on schizophrenia, which he termed dementia praecox, fascinated Jung. Unlike other doctors at the time, Bleuler believed that mental illness was not just psychological disorders, but rather expressions of deep psychological conflict. Jung became obsessed. He realized that medicine alone would not satisfy his quest for understanding. He needed to explore the human psyche in its rawest form. He devoured books on philosophy, mythology, and mysticism, sensing that the key to understanding mental illness lay not just in science, but in symbols, dreams, and the unconscious mind. At this point, Jung was no longer just a medical student. He was a man on a mission to decode the secrets of the psyche. In 1900, Jung graduated from the University of Basel and began working at the Burgosely, one of the most prestigious psychiatric institutions in Europe. Under the guidance of Eugen Bleuler, he was introduced to the latest developments in psychiatry, particularly the emerging field of psychoanalysis. Jung was fascinated by patients suffering from schizophrenia, a disorder that stripped people of their sense of reality. He noticed that many patients seemed to speak in symbols, metaphors, and strange mythological references. Rather than dismissing these as mere delusions, Jung began to wonder, were these symbols part of a deeper language of the mind? Could they be connected to something universal in human psychology? Jung developed a groundbreaking method called the Word Association Test, where he would say a word and ask patients to respond with the first thing that came to mind. What he discovered was astonishing. Certain words triggered delayed responses, emotional reactions, or even distress, revealing unconscious conflicts and hidden traumas. The test provided a map of the psyche, showing where deep-seated fears, repressed memories, and internal struggles were hidden. Jung had stumbled upon what would later become his concept of the complex, cluster of unconscious thoughts and emotions that influence behavior. This discovery brought him into the orbit of a man who would become both his greatest mentor and his fiercest rival, Sigmund Freud. In 1906, Jung's work had gained recognition across Europe. His research on word association and schizophrenia had caught the attention of Sigmund Freud, who at the time was revolutionizing psychology with his theory of the unconscious, repression, and dream analysis. Freud saw Jung as a rising star in the field, someone who could help legitimize psychoanalysis in the scientific community. In 1907, Freud invited Jung to Vienna for a meeting. The two men talked for 13 hours straight, completely engrossed in each other's ideas. Freud saw in Jung a brilliant successor, someone who could carry the torch of psychoanalysis into the next generation. Jung, in turn, was captivated by Freud's theory of the unconscious mind, particularly the idea that repressed emotions and childhood experiences shape adult behavior. Freud even called Jung his crown prince, believing that he would lead the psychoanalytic movement after him. However, beneath the surface of their friendship, tensions were already forming. At first, Jung admired Freud immensely, but as he studied Freud's theories more closely, doubts began to creep in. Freud's model of the mind was built around sexual repression and childhood trauma as the primary forces behind human behavior. He believed that nearly all neuroses could be traced back to repressed sexual desires, an idea that Jung found far too narrow. Jung began to suspect that the unconscious was far more than just a storage place for repressed desires. He believed it was a vast, structured realm filled with symbols, archetypes, and deep psychological forces that were not merely sexual in nature. For example, Jung noticed that many of his patients had dreams and visions containing universal symbols, images of dragons, wise old men, divine mothers, or heroic journeys. These were not just personal fantasies. They seemed to tap into something ancient and collective, something beyond the individual psyche. Jung would later call this the collective unconscious, a theory that would set him on a collision course with Freud. I would like to take a second to ask you, viewer, if you could please take the time, if you enjoy this content, to subscribe, like, ring the bell, all of the good works. Without further ado, we'll return to the video. In 1909, during one of Jung's visits to Freud's home, the two men were engaged in a heated discussion about the paranormal, a subject that fascinated Jung but made Freud deeply uncomfortable. Jung insisted that the unconscious might contain psychic forces beyond simple neuroses, but Freud dismissed such ideas as unscientific superstition. At that moment, something bizarre happened. A loud cracking sound erupted from Freud's wooden bookcase. Jung recalled, while Freud was expressing his critical views, there was a loud noise in the bookcase. I told him that the sound was a so-called catalytic exteriorization phenomenon. Freud dismissed this immediately. I predicted that another crack would happen shortly, and to our astonishment, it did. Freud was visibly shaken, but refused to acknowledge any possibility beyond a physical explanation. For Jung, however, this was a sign that there were forces in the psyche that Freud's theory failed to account for. The event left a lasting impression on Jung and marked a turning point in their relationship. Jung had begun to fully embrace his own path, one that moved beyond Freud's rationalist framework. By 1912, the cracks in their relationship had turned into an irreparable rift. Jung's book, Psychology of the Unconscious, directly challenged Freud's ideas. In it, Jung argued that the unconscious was not just personal, but contained universal symbols and patterns inherited from humanity's shared past. Myths, religious symbols, and archetypal stories were not just random cultural artifacts, but deeply embedded psychological structures. Freud's emphasis on sexual repression was too narrow. Jung believed that the drive for meaning, individuation, and connection to the collective unconscious was just as powerful. Freud was deeply offended by Jung's rejection of his core ideas. Their final meeting was cold and tense, and Freud officially cut ties with Jung. What had once been an intellectual father-son relationship had now become one of psychology's most famous feuds. Breaking away from Freud was not just an academic decision. It shattered Jung's sense of identity. For years, he had been Freud's protégé, his heir, his closest intellectual companion. Now, he was completely alone. Between 1913 and 1917, Jung entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. He withdrew from social life, resigned from his academic positions, and plunged into a terrifying inner world of visions, dreams, and hallucinations. He later described this period as self-induced psychosis, one of which he felt as if he was losing his mind. But instead of resisting it, he allowed himself to fully explore the depths of his own unconsciousness. During this time, Jung had vivid hallucinations of mythological and biblical figures, engaged in imaginary dialogues with strange, otherworldly beings, including a wise old man named Philemon, who became a central figure of his psychological framework. He also created the Red Book, a massive illustrated manuscript where he recorded his visions and attempted to map out the structure of the unconscious. Many have speculated that Jung's experiences during this time were similar to that of what patients of schizophrenia suffered from, except that Jung managed to navigate it without losing himself entirely. Instead of breaking him, this experience gave birth to his greatest theories. Emerging from this dark period, Jung was no longer just a psychoanalyst. He was something entirely new. His ideas, once considered heretical, became the foundation of his own school of psychology. Jungian psychology introduced groundbreaking concepts that would forever change the way we understand the human mind. The collective unconscious, a universal layer of the unconscious mind shared by all humans, filled with the archetypes and inherited memories. Archetypes, universal symbols, and themes such as the hero, the shadow, the wise old man, the mother, and the trickster, which appear in myths, dreams, and religious traditions across all cultures. Individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the conscious and unconscious self. And synchronicity, the idea that meaningful coincidences are not random, but reflect deeper psychic connections. By the 1920s, Jung was no longer just Freud's former student. He was a world-renowned psychologist in his own right. He traveled the world, studied ancient cultures, and developed a psychological framework that bridged science, mythology, and spirituality. By the 1920s, Carl Jung had broken free from Freud's influence and had laid the foundation for his own school of psychology. However, his work was far from finished. If anything, his confrontation with the unconscious had awakened an even deeper hunger, one that could not be satisfied by studying patients in a psychiatric clinic. Jung believed that in order to fully understand the psyche, the soul, and the depths of the unconscious, he needed to step beyond the boundaries of the European science and into the realms of myth, spirituality, and ancient wisdom traditions. After the intense psychological experiences recorded in the Red Book, Jung felt compelled to seek real-world manifestations of the symbols, archetypes, and myths that appeared in his visions. He believed that Western psychology had ignored too much, focusing only on rational thought while neglecting the deep spiritual wisdom found in ancient traditions, indigenous cultures, and mystical practices. So Jung set out on a series of global expeditions, searching for evidence of the collective unconscious in places untouched by European psychoanalysis. In 1925, Jung embarked on his first major expedition outside of Europe, a journey to East Africa, where he hoped to study the psyche in its most primal form. He traveled deep into Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan, spending time with various indigenous groups, including the Algani people near Mount Elgon. What fascinated Jung most was how their dreams, symbols, and rituals reflected universal themes he observed in his European patients. For instance, he noted, dreams of ancestral spirits, animal guides, and initiation rituals, which mirrored similar motifs in European myths. A deep reverence for nature and the cosmos, which he believed showed a more direct connection in the unconscious than modern Western thought allowed, as well as the absence of neuroses in traditional cultures. Jung theorized that people living within their natural mythical framework were more psychologically balanced than modern individuals cut off from such roots. He concluded that the psyche was not shaped purely by personal experience or modern civilization. Rather, it was built on ancient inherited structures of meaning. This insight would later form the basis of his theory of the collective unconscious. In 1924 and 1925, Jung traveled to the American Southwest, where he spent time among the Pueblo people in New Mexico. One of his most profound encounters was with Ochoe Biano, Mountain Lake, a Pueblo elder, who shared his spiritual worldview with Jung. Mountain Lake told Jung, "Your people think with their heads, but we think with our hearts." This statement struck Jung deeply. He realized that modern Western culture had become disconnected from the deeper wisdom of the psyche, relying too much on logic and reason while neglecting intuition, ritual, and symbolic mind. Jung was also fascinated with the Pueblo sun worship traditions, seeing them as expressions of the same archetypal structures that appeared in Christianity, Hinduism, and ancient Egyptian religion. This experience reinforced Jung's belief that myth, ritual, and symbolic thinking were not primitive relics, but essential parts of the human mind, ones that Western psychology had wrongly dismissed. In 1938, Jung traveled to India, where he encountered Hinduism, Buddhism, and Vedic traditions. India left an enormous impact on Jung because it provided a living model of ideas he had already discovered through psychology. The Hindu concept of the Atman, or the self, closely resembled his ideas of individuation, where one moves beyond the ego and unites with a deeper, true self. The Buddhist notion of enlightenment reminded Jung of psychological integration, where a person comes to terms with their shadow and unconscious forces. The balance of opposites, such as yin-yang in Eastern philosophy, mirrored his concept of the union of opposites in alchemy and individuation. However, Jung also believed that Eastern philosophy could not simply be adopted by Western minds. He thought Westerners had to go through their own psychological transformation, rather than borrow foreign religious ideas without fully understanding them. His time in India reinforced this belief, that spirituality and psychology were deeply connected, a radical idea at a time when most psychologists dismissed religious experiences as mere superstition. Jung's travel and studies led him deeper into alchemy, an ancient practice that sought to transform base metals into gold. At first glance, alchemy seemed like nothing more than medieval superstition, but Jung saw something else, a symbolic map of psychological transformation. He realized that alchemists were not just trying to create physical gold, they were expressing the process of individuation through symbolic, mystical language. The Negredo, blackening stage, represented the dark night of the soul, where the individual faces their shadow and deeper fears. The Albedo, whitening stage, symbolized self-reflection and purification, integrating unconscious material into conscious awareness. The Rubedo, reddening stage, was the final step, where the individual achieves wholeness and unites their conscious and unconscious mind. Jung saw alchemy as the missing link between psychology, myth, and spirituality, a forgotten symbolic language of transformation that could help modern individuals navigate their own psychological growth. By the end of Jung's global explorations, he had gathered real-world evidence for his theory of the collective unconscious after finding universal symbols and myths across different cultures. He realized that modern Western thought had become disconnected from the deep psychological wisdom found in mythology, religion, and indigenous traditions. His studies of alchemy, Hinduism, and Buddhism deepened his understanding of the psychological transformations and individuation. He saw himself not just as a scientist, but as a bridge between psychology and ancient wisdom, offering a new version of the human mind. Jung's explorations were not just about gathering knowledge. They were a personal quest to understand the depths of the unconscious. His travels reshaped the entire approach to psychology, giving birth to ideas that continue to influence therapy, philosophy, and spirituality today. But his work was not finished yet. In the next chapter, Jung would fully develop his theories of individuation, shadow work, and the deep journey towards psychological wholeness, ideas that would become the foundation of modern Jungian psychology. By the time Jung returned from his global explorations in 1930, he had pieced together a new vision of psychology, one that combined modern science, mythology, religion, and ancient wisdom. But there was still one fundamental question that haunted him. How does a person achieve true psychological wholeness? This chapter explores Jung's most important psychological concept, the individuation process. It is the journey each person must take to integrate their consciousness and unconscious self, to face their shadow, and to become their true whole self. This deep psychological journey, Jung believed, was the key to overcoming inner conflict, living a meaningful life, and achieving true self-actualization. For Jung, therapy was not just about fixing mental illness. It was about helping people become who they were meant to be. Individuation, according to Jung, is the process of integrating the unconscious mind with the conscious mind, bringing hidden aspects of the psyche into awareness, balancing conflicting parts of the self. Unlike Freud, who saw psychological health as managing repressed desires, Jung saw it as a spiritual and psychological transformation, a path that every human is naturally called to follow. But individuation is not easy. It requires deep self-exploration, confronting uncomfortable truths, and breaking free from societal expectations. Jung believed that the process often begins with suffering, a personal crisis, a feeling of emptiness, or a breakdown that forces someone to look inward. Only by facing the unconscious can a person become a truly whole individual, not just a fragmented mask living for social approval. Jung outlined a step-by-step process that every individual must go through to achieve wholeness. This path is often symbolized in myths, religious stories, and alchemy, where the hero must face trials, descend into darkness, and emerge transformed, encountering the persona, the mask we wear. The first step in individuation is recognizing the persona, the social mask we wear in public. The persona is the false self we present to fit into society. It helps us function in the world, but also hides our true nature. Many people mistake the persona for their real identity, trapping themselves in roles they don't truly identify with. Jung believed that many psychological issues come from over-identifying with a persona. Individuation begins when a person starts to question their persona and asks, "Who am I?" Really, beneath all these expectations. The questioning often leads to the next, darker stage, the confrontation with the shadow self. The shadow self is the part of ourselves that we suppress, deny, or fear, the aspects we do not want to acknowledge. It contains repressed desires and instincts, weaknesses and insecurities, hidden potential and creative energy. Jung believed that the most people want to avoid their shadow, fearing what they might find, but ignoring it only makes it more powerful, causing it to manifest in destructive ways through self-sabotage, addiction, aggression, or projection onto others. To integrate the shadow, one must acknowledge their own darkness instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Accept their flaws, fears, and suppressed emotions rather than running from them, and recognize the shadow self in others instead of judging or blaming. Jung believed that society's greatest evils, such as war, discrimination, mass hysteria, happen when people project their own shadow onto others, seeing them as the enemy, rather than recognizing their own inner darkness. To become whole, a person must embrace their shadow, realizing that it's not purely evil, it also holds untapped strength, power, and authenticity. This is a quote from Carl Jung. He says, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In the next stage of individuation, Jung identified another hidden force within the psyche, the anima and the animus. The anima is the feminine aspect in men, their inner sensitivity, creativity, and emotional depth. The animus is the masculine aspect in women, their inner strength, independence, and assertiveness. If ignored, these aspects can create imbalances. A man who suppresses his anima might be overly rigid, emotionally distant, or unable to form deep relationships. A woman who denies her animus might feel powerless, dependent, or afraid to assert herself. Jung believed that individuation requires embracing both masculine and feminine energies, creating a balance of logic, intuition, strength, and companionship. This is often symbolized in myths by the union of opposites, such as the sacred marriage of the sun and moon, king and queen, hero and goddess, yin and yang. The final step, the ultimate goal of individuation, is the realization of the self, the total integrated personality, where all aspects of the psyche, the persona, shadow self, anima, animus are all in harmony. This is the stage where a person becomes their authentic self, not controlled by ego, society, or unconscious fears. The self is often represented in dreams and myths as a circle, mandala, or wise figure. It is a state of true wholeness and psychological balance. It allows a person to live with purpose, meaning, and deep self-awareness. In mythology, the final stage is often depicted as the return of the hero, where after many trials, the hero brings back wisdom to share with the world. For Jung, individuation was a lifelong process, not something to be achieved quickly, but a path that unfolds through deep self-exploration and conscious growth. Jung believed that many modern problems, depression, anxiety, existential crises, come from people being disconnected from their deeper selves. Society often pushes people to conform rather than individuate. Many people never face their shadow, instead blaming others or escaping into distractions. Without individuation, people feel lost, unfulfilled, and inauthentic. Jung saw individuation as the solution to this crisis, a way for people to reclaim their true identity, find meaning, and create a life of psychological depth. By the time Carl Jung entered the final decades of his life, he had become one of the most influential and controversial thinkers of the 20th century. His theories had revolutionized psychology, but they had also set him apart from the mainstream scientific community, as his work ventured into the realms of myth, spirituality, and the unconscious mind in ways that many psychologists resisted. Despite this, Jung remained deeply committed to his work, continuing to write, teach, and refine his theories. He spent his later years not just as a scientist, but as a philosopher, a mystic, and a man reflecting on the great mystery of existence. This chapter explores his personal struggles and final discoveries, his near-death experience, his views on the afterlife and the meaning of life, and his lasting impact on psychology and the modern culture. As he grew older, Jung found himself less interested in proving his theories and more concerned with the wisdom gained from a lifetime of studying the psyche. By the 1920s, Jung had built a retreat for himself along the shores of Lake Zurich, a stone structure known as the Bollingen Tower. This would become his spiritual sanctuary, where he would escape from the demands of the world and immerse himself in deep contemplation. Jung did much of his writing at Bollingen, finding peace in the simplicity of manual labor, carving symbolic features into stone, and living in harmony with nature. He often said that Bollingen represented his true self, a place where he could exist outside of his persona, away from the role of a scientist, teacher, and doctor. He saw Bollingen as an extension of his own individuation process, a physical manifestation of the inner journey he had undertaken through his life. At times, I feel as if I am spread out over the landscape and inside things, and am myself living in every tree, in the splashing of the waves, in the clouds, and in the animals that come and go. In 1944, at the age of 68, Jung suffered a massive heart attack. While unconscious, he experienced a profound near-death vision, an event that would forever change his perspective on life, death, and the afterlife. Jung later described seeing Earth from high above, floating beyond space and time. He found himself approaching a giant temple, suspended in the cosmos, radiating an overwhelming sense of peace and knowledge. He sensed that if he entered, he would leave beyond his earthly existence forever. At the same time, he became aware of his doctor's presence on Earth, trying to revive him. He felt as though he had a choice, whether to pass into this higher realm or return to his physical body. Ultimately, he had chosen to live, feeling that he still had unfinished work to do. After recovering, Jung spoke often of this mystical experience, believing it was a glimpse into the deepest layers of the unconscious, or even the afterlife itself. This event strengthened his belief that consciousness does not end with death, but rather transitions into a greater reality. Life is a luminous pause between two great mysteries. Carl Jung. In the years that followed, Jung focused his writings on the meaning of life, death, and the search for wholeness. Some of his final works include Aeon, the psychological meaning of Christ and the self, explored how Christ symbolized the self and the archetype of wholeness, and examined the good and evil in the psyche, arguing that humanity must integrate its darker side rather than repress it. Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle, introducing the idea that coincidences are not random, but meaningful connections between the mind and the universe. Synchronicity suggested that the unconscious is linked to external reality, giving meaning to events that seem like pure chance. A good example of this would be thinking about an old friend you haven't seen in years, and suddenly receiving a call from them, an experience many people have had. Another book would be Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, its autobiography, a deeply personal reflection on his childhood, dreams, visions, and lifelong search for meaning. This revealed his mystical side, detailing experiences that mainstream psychology often dismissed. If you enjoyed this video and enjoy Carl Jung, I highly recommend this book if you want to know more about his life. Carl Jung passed away on June 6, 1961, at the age of 85 in his home in Switzerland. In the final days, he remained at peace, having spent a lifetime unraveling the mysteries of the human psyche. His last recorded dream was of a great tree, with roots extending deep into the earth, and branches reaching toward the heavens, a powerful symbol of the union of the conscious and unconscious mind. Before his death, Jung wrote, "I have no certainty about myself, but the more uncertain I have felt about myself, the more there has grown up in me a feeling of kinship with all things." His work was unfinished. Perhaps that was the point. He had mapped the road to individuation, but the journey itself was one that each person had to take alone. Although Jung was dismissed by many in the scientific community during his lifetime, his influence has only grown stronger over the decades. Today his ideas have shaped psychology, philosophy, art, literature, film, and even spirituality. Jung's concept of archetypes, the collective unconscious, shadow work are now widely studied in therapy and self-development. His work directly influenced depth psychology, dream analysis, and personality theory. The Myers-Briggs type indicator was based on Jung's theories of personality. I am personally an ENTP. Comment yours in below. Many modern spiritual practices, including shadow work, inner healing, and synchronicity, stem from Jung's ideas. He helped bridge the gap between psychology and mysticism, arguing that the religious symbols hold deep psychological meaning. He also had influence over art, literature, and film. Filmmakers like George Lucas used Jungian archetypes in Star Wars. Writers like Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces, applied Jung's theories to mythology and shaping modern storytelling, such as The Hero's Journey. Jung's vision of the human psyche as a vast, mysterious, and interconnected realm continues to inspire psychologists, philosophers, and seekers of truth, like you. Carl Jung's legacy is not just in the books he wrote or the theories he created. It is in the countless people who have used his ideas to understand themselves, confront their fears, and embark on their own journey of individuation. He dared to explore the darkest corners of the mind when others looked away. He saw meaning where others saw chaos. He believed that every individual holds the potential for self-transformation, wholeness, and self-realization. In the end, Jung left behind more than just psychology. He left behind a map for the soul. I will leave this video with one final quote from Carl Jung. "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." Before I end this video, I wanted to say thank you for the viewers that made it this far. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're interested in seeing more videos like this, please comment below. Any interests I will read. Thank you.